My name is Luciana Ibarra. I am 24 years old, and I used to believe that the people who loved you could not also be the people who diminished you most completely. I was wrong. I have had a stutter since I was 7 years old. That is the fact I have to give you first, because everything else in this story rests on it. Not because the stutter is the most important thing about me, it isn't, but because for the people in my family it functioned as a kind of organizing principle. It was the thing they reached for when they needed to explain why I was the way I was, why certain doors should remain gently, warmly closed to me. My stutter is what clinicians call a developmental stutter. It appeared after a high fever in 2nd grade, was moderate through elementary school, and by high school had settled into a pattern I understood well enough to manage. Certain sounds were harder than others. Under stress it worsened. In calm, predictable environments it nearly disappeared. In the car alone, singing along to the radio, it was gone entirely. I had spent 11 years in speech therapy, with gaps for insurance changes, a move from Albuquerque to Portland when I was 14, and my first year of college. But across those years I had done the work. I knew my patterns. I knew how to slow my breath before a hard passage and approach a difficult sound from the side rather than head-on. My speech-language pathologist at Oregon told me in my junior year that I had developed an internal scaffolding that most people with moderate developmental stutters never achieve. The anchor object in this story is a digital audio recorder. Small, black, about the size of a deck of cards. I had bought it in my junior year of college to record my thesis presentation rehearsals. By the time this story takes place, I kept it in my desk drawer at the nonprofit and occasionally in my bag. I want you to know it exists. I will come back to it. I graduated from the University of Oregon with a degree in communications, a 3.8 GPA, and a thesis on the rhetorical strategies of disabled public speakers in 20th-century American political history. I gave a 17-minute presentation of that thesis to a committee of 4 faculty members and answered 20 minutes of questions afterward. I did not stutter once. My family did not come to my thesis presentation. My father, Roberto Ibarra, said the drive from Portland was too long for a school thing. My mother had a work conflict. My sister Valentina, who was 27 and lived 30 minutes from Eugene, said she had plans. I drove back to Portland alone after the presentation with my thesis committee's written comments on the passenger seat and a gas station coffee going cold in the cup holder. The highway was quiet and the sky was doing something extraordinary over the Coast Range, all orange and gray, and I thought, I just did the hardest thing I have done in an academic setting and no one who shares my blood knows it happened. If you have ever achieved something in a room where no one who loves you is watching, something you earned, something that took years, you will understand the specific texture of that drive. It is not self-pity. It is something quieter and more precise than that. Hold on to that feeling for a moment, because what I am about to describe is what that feeling looks like when it is given a shape by the people closest to you. I moved back to Portland 3 weeks after graduation. I took a position as a communications coordinator at a nonprofit that served adults with acquired disabilities, people navigating the world after strokes, traumatic brain injuries, late-onset hearing loss. I had found the job through a contact from my thesis research. The work suited me. I spent most of my days writing grant narratives, coordinating with program staff, and occasionally sitting in on client intake sessions as a note-taker. My supervisor, Priya, told me in my 3-month review that my written communications were the strongest she had seen from someone at my level and that she wanted to develop me toward a senior coordinator role within the year. I lived 20 minutes from my parents' house in a rented studio apartment on the east side of the city. My father managed the receiving department at a regional grocery distribution center. My mother, Carmen, had worked for 8 years as an executive assistant to the regional director of a mid-sized logistics company called Meridian Freight Solutions. Valentina worked in sales at a software company downtown, drove a leased car she referenced often, and had the family's gift for filling a room with herself. Sunday dinners at my parents' house were the grammar of our family life. My mother cooked, my father watched whatever game was on before we sat down. Valentina arrived 15 minutes late with a bottle of wine and a story about her week that expanded to fill the available time. I arrived on time, helped my mother in the kitchen, and mostly listened. This was the shape of my life the year I turned 24. Ordinary, mostly quiet, and organized around a set of assumptions about my place in my family that I had not yet thought to examine too carefully. The incident that named the pattern happened on a Sunday in late October, 8 months after I moved back to Portland. My mother had mentioned the week before that she was going to invite her colleague Patricia to dinner. Not her boss, just a co-worker, she said, someone from the office who was new to Portland and didn't know many people yet. She asked me to come and said it might be nice to have the family together for a proper meal. I said I would be there. Valentina said she would try. Valentina arrived at 6:15, 20 minutes after Patricia, with a bottle of Pinot Gris and her coat half off before she was through the door. Patricia was quiet, pleasant, somewhere in her 40s, with the careful social manner of someone still learning the geography of a new city. We sat down to eat at 6:30. The table was the same round table we had eaten at my whole life, pale wood, slightly uneven on one leg, pushed against the window that looked out onto the backyard. The conversation over dinner was easy enough. Patricia asked about the city. My father talked about traffic patterns with the confidence of a man who drives a lot. My mother described a waterfront trail she liked for walking on weekends. I mentioned a coffee shop near my apartment that had become a reliable place to work on grant drafts on Saturday mornings. Valentina said, Luciana works at a nonprofit. She writes things. She said it the way you might describe a child's drawing, fondly, with a particular kind of airiness that communicated that the thing being described was not entirely serious. Patricia looked at me. What kind of writing? I said, grant and narratives mostly. Funding proposals. Some program communications. The slight catch on narratives, less than a second, a small repetition of the N was real. It happens more when I'm conscious of being listened to closely by someone new. I knew it as soon as it happened and I kept my expression still. Valentina said, she's being modest. She has a whole, what is it, Lucy? Speech thing she does. Patricia said, a speech thing? I said, I studied rhetoric. My thesis was on disabled public speakers. She means the stutter, Valentina said pleasantly across the table. She said it with the ease of someone identifying a familiar piece of furniture. Luciana has a stutter. She's had it her whole life. She's very brave about it. The word brave landed on the table like something dropped from a height. Patricia looked uncomfortable. She looked at her fork. She said, oh, I hadn't noticed. Valentina said, most people don't at first. It comes out more when she's nervous. I squared the bread plate in front of me with 2 fingers and said nothing. My father took a piece of bread from the basket. My mother refreshed Patricia's water glass. The conversation moved on to something about Valentina's company's quarterly numbers and a sales incentive trip to Scottsdale she was hoping to qualify for. I ate my dinner. The aftermath came later, in the kitchen, when Patricia had gone home and my father had moved to the living room. Valentina was rinsing glasses at the sink. My mother was putting away the leftover chicken. I was at the counter with a dish towel. I said, you didn't need to tell her about the stutter. Valentina looked at me with something that resembled surprise. I was just being real, she said. It's not a secret. It's also not an introduction, I said. Valentina set a glass on the drying rack. Lucy, she said, you literally caught on a word in front of her. It's better to just name it. It makes it less awkward. For who? I said. Valentina didn't answer that. She turned off the faucet and dried her hands. My mother said from across the kitchen, Valentina was trying to help. I folded the dish towel and laid it on the counter. I said okay. I drove home with the radio off. The October dinner was not the beginning. The beginning was earlier than I could accurately date. It had been built so gradually and with so much family warmth that I had not recognized it as a structure until I was old enough to step back and see the shape. The clearest early memory I have is from when I was 13. We were at my maternal grandmother's house in Albuquerque for Thanksgiving, a crowded house, aunts and uncles and cousins, the particular noise of a large family that has not been in the same room for months. I had been placed, as I often was at family events, at the children's table. But the memory I want to name is from after dinner, when the adults had moved to the living room and I was helping my grandmother clear the table. My grandmother, Abuela Consuelo, was a small woman who moved efficiently and said little that was not necessary. She handed me a stack of dessert plates and said in Spanish, "You speak well, Mija. Don't let them make you small." I didn't know what she meant. I was 13. I thought she was talking about the children's table. Later that evening, my cousin Diego, who was 15 and had learned cruelty the way adolescent boys often do, quickly by observing who got away with it, asked me to tell a joke in front of the group of cousins gathered in the den. When I started to speak and caught briefly on the first word, he laughed in a specific way, not loud, not pointed, but with a small smile that signaled to the others that something funny had happened. Valentina, who was 16 and in the doorway, said nothing. She watched. Then she turned and went back to the living room. I remember thinking, she could have said something. The thought was clear, even at 13. She could have said something and she didn't, and that was also a choice. I want to place another memory here, the year I came back from Eugene. I had graduated on a Thursday morning. 4 faculty on my committee. 17 minutes of thesis presentation. 20 minutes of Q&A. I did not stutter once. My father said the drive was too long for a school thing. He found out I had passed from a text I sent that afternoon and replied, "Good job, Lucy." Then he forwarded me a photo of a parking lot construction project he thought looked interesting. That is not cartoon villainy. That is a man who measured importance by whether it interrupted his Saturday, and who had no idea that was a verdict. The labor I want to account for is not dramatic. It is the small accumulative work of someone who has spent years proving competence in the margins, in the spaces where no one is officially watching. I had spent 3 years in college serving as a note-taker for 3 different students with disabilities through the university's accommodation office. Not for credit, not for pay, as a volunteer, because I understood from the inside what it meant to need the system to work correctly. I had typed over 400 pages of lecture notes across those 3 years. I had written my mother's performance review self-assessment for 2 consecutive years at Meridian. She came to me with her notes, I organized them into the format the HR system required, and she submitted them under her name. Her director had specifically commended the clarity of her self-assessment both years. I had drafted the personal statement for Valentina's application to a sales training program at her company. She'd come to me on a Wednesday evening with 3 bullet points and a deadline of Friday. I had written her a 400-word statement that evening. She was accepted to the program. I had handled my parents' homeowners insurance appeal when their claim for water damage was initially denied, reading the policy language, writing a formal appeal letter that cited the specific exclusion the adjuster had misapplied, and submitting it with supporting documentation. The claim was approved on the second review. The payout was $11,400. My father told the neighbors the insurance company had come around. I had managed every piece of paperwork around my grandmother Consuelo's assisted living transition when she moved from Albuquerque to a facility in Portland 3 years ago, coordinating with the facility's intake team, organizing her Medicare documentation, handling the out-of-state care transfer in a system that was not designed for it to be easy. My mother had cried twice during that process. Both times she was on the phone with a facility administrator and couldn't continue. Both times I took the phone. The second remembered incident I want to place here happened the spring of my first year back in Portland. I had been invited to present at a small internal communications workshop at my nonprofit. Priya had asked me to walk the program staff through how to talk about our services to potential donors, a 20-minute presentation to an audience of about 15 people. I prepared carefully. I had notes. I had practiced with the recorder. The morning of the workshop I was calm, the kind of calm that comes from preparation, not from the absence of feeling. I mentioned it to my mother the night before on the phone. She said, "Oh, good for you. Are you nervous?" I said I wasn't particularly. She said, "Well, just remember to breathe. And if you get stuck, it's okay to pause. People are patient." I said, "I know, Mom." She said, "I just don't want it to be embarrassing for you." I held the phone against my ear and looked at the ceiling. "I'll be fine," I said. The workshop went well. Priya said afterward that 3 of the program staff had come to her separately to say it was the clearest explanation of our donor messaging they had heard. She said she wanted me to run the same session for the board development committee in the fall. I called my mother that evening to tell her. She said, "That's great, honey. Did you have any trouble?" I said no. She said good. I'm glad. And then she asked if I'd heard from Valentina, because Valentina was having a hard week with her sales numbers and my mother thought it might be nice if I checked in. I said I would. I set my phone down on my kitchen counter and stood there for a moment in the quiet of my apartment. I was not devastated, I had stopped expecting more than that. But something in me had been keeping score for a long time, and I was tired of pretending it wasn't. The dinner that changed everything was scheduled for a Saturday in February, 4 months after the October dinner with Patricia. My mother called me on a Thursday to ask if I could come. She sounded different on the phone, not nervous exactly, but careful in a way she wasn't usually careful. She said that her boss, the regional director at Meridian, was coming to dinner with his wife. She said his name was Douglas Hale. She said he had been with Meridian for 22 years and that he was the kind of man who appreciated a well-run household. A well-run household, I said. You know what I mean, she said. He's formal. Old school. He notices things. I asked if there was something specific she needed me to do. She said, just come. Be pleasant. Don't just be easy. I understood what don't and just be easy were pointing toward. I had understood that signal my whole life. It was the signal that preceded family events where I was expected to be present but not prominent, comfortable but not conspicuous, a daughter but not particularly herself. I said I would be there at 6. Valentina called me Friday evening. She said, so Mom's big boss is coming tomorrow. I know, I said. Should be fun, she said, with an inflection that made it clear she found the prospect entertaining in a way that did not include me. Mom's been cleaning since Tuesday. There was a pause. Valentina said, hey Lucy, just a heads up. I know how you get in formal situations. Maybe tomorrow night let me do most of the talking, yeah? It'll just be easier for everyone. I was sitting at my desk. I had my hand resting on the recorder in my desk drawer, not intentionally, I had just set it there when I came home from work. I'll be fine, Val, I said. I know, she said. I just mean with the stutter. It might come out more if you're stressed and he might not, she paused. Mom really needs this to go well. My fingers closed around the recorder. I said, I'll be there at 6. I put the recorder in my bag that night. I am not sure I can fully explain why. It was a habit from my thesis years, something I did when I knew I was going to do something hard and I wanted to have the record of it. I was not planning anything. I was not thinking about a confrontation or a reveal. I was just a person who had learned over many years to document the things she did so they would exist somewhere outside of the room where no one acknowledged them. I arrived at my parents' house on Saturday at 5:55. My mother was in the kitchen. My father was in the living room in his good shirt. The house smelled like the pot roast my mother made for company, bay leaves and red wine and something underneath that smelled like every formal occasion of my childhood. Valentina arrived at 6:20 with a bottle of wine and a story about the parking. She kissed my mother's cheek, said the table looked beautiful, and turned to me with a particular smile. You look nice, she said. It was the smile that meant, stay small tonight. I set my bag on the chair near the hallway, the recorder inside it, and went to help my mother arrange the bread basket. Douglas Hale arrived at 6:30 with his wife Ellen. He was in his mid-60s, compact and upright, with the manner of a man who had managed people for a long time and knew exactly how much of himself he was showing at any given moment. He shook my father's hand, kissed my mother's cheek, and accepted a glass of sparkling water with the ease of someone who had been a guest in many homes. Ellen was warm, conversational, a retired high school teacher who had the particular gift of making people feel immediately comfortable. She asked my mother about the pot roast recipe. She asked my father about his work. She asked Valentina what industry she was in and listened to the answer with genuine interest. She asked me what I did. I said, I work in communications. Grant writing mostly at a non-profit that serves adults with acquired disabilities. The catch was small. 2 sounds, no repetition, less than 2 seconds total. I was aware of it the way you are aware of a step that is slightly higher than you expected. You catch it, you correct, you keep walking. Ellen said, oh, how interesting. What kind of disabilities? I said, primarily AC-acquired neurological. Post-stroke, traumatic brain injury, late-onset hearing loss. We focus on helping people navigate employment and independent living after a significant diagnosis. Douglas Hale, who had been in conversation with my father, had turned slightly toward me as I spoke. Not fully, just enough that I was in his sightline. Ellen said, that sounds meaningful. Do you work directly with clients or more on the administrative side? I said, mostly writing and program communications. But I sit in on intake sessions sometimes as a note-taker, and I do some public-facing work. I ran a donor communication workshop for our board development committee in the fall. Valentina said, Lucy's being modest. Tell them about the stutter, Lucy. It's actually really inspiring. The table was quiet for one breath. Douglas Hale set his sparkling water glass down on the tablecloth with a care that looked deliberate. He looked at Valentina. He looked at me. His expression had changed in a way I couldn't immediately categorize, not pity, not discomfort. Something more interior than that. He said, "You work in communications." "Yes," I said. He said, "And you presented to a board development committee." "In October," I said. 15 board members. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What was your thesis on?" My mother looked at him. I said, "The rhetorical strategies of disabled public speakers in 20th century American political history. Specifically how stutter prominent speakers, Marilyn Monroe, John Updike, James Earl Jones, developed techniques for using their speech pattern as a rhetorical tool rather than managing it as a liability." The table was very still. Douglas Hale looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "James Earl Jones had a stutter." "Severe developmental stutter," I said. "He was selectively mute for several years as a child. He managed it primarily through reading Shakespeare aloud." Douglas Hale said, "I know." He picked up his water glass again. "I know because my son has a stutter. Has had one since he was 9. He looked at the glass. Then at me. "He's 22. He's been told by 3 different people this year, in 3 different professional settings, that he should consider careers that don't require public speaking." The room was absolutely quiet. Douglas looked at Valentina briefly. Then back at me. "Who supervised your thesis?" He said. I said, "Dr. Reese at the University of Oregon. She's a speech-language pathologist and communications faculty." Douglas nodded slowly. "I'd like to hear more about your work," he said. "After dinner." My mother was looking at her plate. Valentina had her wine glass raised halfway to her mouth and had not moved. I said, "Of course." I reached into the bread basket, took a piece of bread, and set the basket back in the center of the table. After dinner, my mother served coffee in the living room. It was a small reshuffling. My father took his usual chair, my mother settled on the end of the sofa nearest the kitchen doorway, and Valentina positioned herself on the arm of the couch in the way she always did at family gatherings, slightly elevated, slightly central. Douglas Hale sat in the chair across from mine. Ellen had gone to help my mother with the cups. It was, for a few minutes, just the 2 of us and my father and Valentina on the periphery. Douglas said, "Tell me about the board presentation." I said, "It was a donor communication workshop. 15 board members. I walked them through how we talk about our programs to different funding audiences, what language works for a corporate foundation versus a family foundation, how to frame impact data for donors who respond to numbers versus donors who respond to narrative." "How long?" 35 minutes with questions. Douglas nodded. "And before that, you said you presented your thesis to a committee." "For faculty members. 17 minutes of presentation, 20 minutes of questions." "You didn't stutter in either setting," he said. "It was not a question exactly. It was an observation being tested." "I caught twice in the thesis questions," I said. "Both times I slowed my breath and redirected the approach to the sound. Neither disrupted the flow of the answer." Douglas said, "My son locks completely under pressure. Job interviews. Presentations. He describes it as a wall he can't get around." "That's a common pattern," I said. "The anticipatory anxiety creates a secondary block on top of the primary one. Most of the clinical work now focuses on reducing the anticipatory response rather than managing the stutter itself." Douglas looked at me steadily. "You sound like you know the research." "I wrote 40 pages on it," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Ellen came back with the coffee tray and set it on the table between us. She looked at Douglas and then at me with the expression of someone who had walked into the middle of something and recognized it correctly. Valentina said from the sofa arm, "Douglas, Luciana's always been the reader in the family. She retains things." Douglas looked at Valentina briefly. Then he looked back at me. He said, "Do you still have the thesis?" I said, "The full document, yes. And I have recordings of the presentation rehearsals. I used a digital recorder to practice. I can hear myself in playback more clearly than I can in the moment. It helps me identify where the anticipatory pattern is building before it becomes a block." Douglas set his coffee cup down. "You recorded yourself," he said. "For 4 years," I said. "Starting sophomore year." I have probably 60 hours of recorded rehearsal across the thesis project alone. Valentina laughed, a small social laugh, the kind that tries to reset the temperature of a room. 60 hours, she said. Lucy, you never told us that. You never asked, I said. The room was quiet. I reached into my bag, which was on the floor beside my chair. I took out the recorder. It was smaller than it looked in memory, just a black rectangle worn at the corners, with a small speaker grill on the front and a USB port on the bottom. I set it on the coffee table. Douglas leaned forward slightly. I said, "This is from a rehearsal 3 days before the thesis defense. I'm going through the Q&A section, which is where I was most likely to block because I couldn't predict the questions." I pressed play. My own voice came out of the small speaker, calm and measured, working through a practice question about the rhetorical limitations of visible disability in televised political debate. There was one moment, about 40 seconds in, where I caught briefly on the word predominantly and redirected without pause, continuing the sentence without breaking the line of the argument. I let it run for 90 seconds. Then I stopped it. Douglas Hale was looking at the recorder. He said, "You taught yourself that redirection technique." "Dr. Reese at Oregon gave me the framework," I said. "The 60 hours gave me the muscle." He sat back. He said, "What's the name of the framework?" "Voluntary stuttering combined with cancellation technique. You deliberately introduce a mild stutter on an easy sound before a hard one, which reduces the anticipatory spike. Then if you do block, you pause, release, and restart the word calmly rather than pushing through." Ellen said quietly, "Would that work for someone who's been told his whole life to just push through?" "Pushing through is the worst thing for it," I said. "It trains the anticipatory response to spike higher every time." Douglas said, "His speech therapist told him to push through." I said, "Then he needs a different speech therapist." The room held that for a moment. My father cleared his throat. He looked at his coffee cup. He had not spoken since the living room conversation began, which was unusual for him. My father was comfortable in most rooms, but this was a room that had organized itself around something he didn't have a map for. I watched him set his cup down and look at the recorder on the table. He had never heard me practice. He had never been in the room for the 60 hours. He had driven past Eugene without stopping and told me the drive was too long for a school thing, and now he was sitting across from his boss's boss in his good shirt while that man leaned forward to hear more. Douglas said to me, "Would you be willing to speak with my son?" I said, "Yes." Valentina said, "Douglas, I don't know that Luciana is really, she's not a therapist, she's a—" "I know what she is," Douglas said. He said it without sharpness. He said it the way you state a fact that has already been established and does not require further discussion. Valentina was quiet. Douglas reached into his jacket pocket and took out a business card. He set it on the coffee table beside the recorder. "My personal cell is on the back," he said. "I'd like to connect the two of you. Whatever you're comfortable with, a phone call, a coffee. He's in Portland." I picked up the card. I turned it over. There was a number written in pen on the back in the careful print of someone who writes things down deliberately. I said, "I'll reach out this week." He nodded. Ellen touched my arm once lightly and said, "Thank you." Douglas and Ellen left at 9:30. My father walked them to the door. My mother stood in the living room with her hands folded in front of her, looking at the coffee table where the recorder still sat. Valentina picked up the wine glasses and carried them to the kitchen without saying anything. I sat for a moment. Then I picked up the recorder and put it back in my bag. My mother said, "I didn't know about the recordings." "I know," I said. She said, "That was impressive, Lucy." I looked at her. She meant it, I could see that she meant it, and that made it more complicated, not less, because the woman who had told me not to be embarrassing and who had handed the phone to me twice during her mother's care transfer without acknowledging it was standing in the same body as the woman who had just watched her boss be moved by something her daughter had built over 4 years alone. I said, "I'd like to say some things. I'd like you both to hear them." My father had come back in from the door. He sat down in his chair. My mother sat on the sofa. Valentina came back from the kitchen and stood in the doorway. I kept my voice level. I said, "Dad, when I graduated in June you told me the drive from Portland was too long for a school thing. What I was actually doing that Thursday morning was standing in front of 4 faculty members and defending 4 years of work and not stuttering once. You found out from a text I sent from the parking lot." My father's jaw tightened. He looked at his hands. I said, Val, at the October dinner you told Patricia I was brave about my stutter. You said it comes out more when I'm nervous. What I was actually doing at that point was managing a 2-second catch while discussing grant narrative writing, which I do professionally every day. You described it as a condition to a stranger before she had finished her first impression of me. Valentina opened her mouth. I said, I'm not finished. She closed it. You called me the night before this dinner, I said, and told me to let you do the talking because it would be easier for everyone. What I was actually doing that night was preparing to speak in a formal setting with my mother's boss, which I am more equipped to do than you know, because I have spent 4 years recording myself doing it and building the technique to do it well. I looked at my mother. Mom, before my nonprofit workshop you told me to remember to breathe and said you didn't want it to be embarrassing for me. What I was actually doing that morning was delivering a 30-minute presentation that 3 program staff members came to Priya about separately to say was the clearest donor messaging explanation they had heard. You asked me afterward if I'd had any trouble. Then you asked me to check on Valentina's sales numbers. My mother's hands were still folded. She was looking at the coffee table. I wrote your self-assessments 2 years in a row, I said. Your director commended the clarity of them both times. I wrote Valentina's personal statement for her sales training program. I handled Abuela Consuelo's care transfer paperwork when you couldn't stay on the phone. I won the insurance appeal on the water damage claim. I paused. I'm not telling you these things because I want credit for them. I'm telling you because I have spent years being described as brave for managing something I am actually quite good at, and invisible for doing things that were simply expected of me. And tonight a man I had never met listened to me for 20 minutes and offered me something none of you thought to. The room was quiet for a long time. My father said, Lucy. I know you love me, I said. That's not what this is about. Valentina said from the doorway, I wasn't trying to hurt you. I know, I said. That's part of what I'm telling you. I picked up my bag. I stood up. My mother said, Will you call Douglas's son? Yes, I said. She nodded. She looked like she was going to say something else. Then she didn't. I kissed her cheek. I said goodnight to my father. I looked at Valentina in the doorway and she stepped aside, not dramatically, just to give me room to pass. I walked out of the house and pulled the front door shut behind me with one hand, feeling the latch catch, and kept walking to my car. I called Douglas Hale's son the following Tuesday. His name was Marcus. He was 22, a recent graduate trying to break into project management, and he had a stutter that was, as Douglas had described, significantly more severe than mine under pressure. He had developed the pushing through habit over years of being told that fluency was the goal. We talked for 2 hours. I sent him Dr. Reese's contact information. I sent him 3 papers from my thesis research. I sent him a 30-minute clip from my own rehearsal recordings, the ones from my worst weeks, the ones where the blocks were long and the recoveries were clumsy, because I wanted him to see the before, not just the after. He called me the following Sunday to tell me he had made an appointment with Dr. Reese. I sat on my kitchen floor when I hung up. Not because I was overwhelmed, just because that is where I happened to be, leaning against the cabinet, with the late morning light coming through the window at a low angle, and it felt like exactly the right place to be for a moment. There is a thing that happens when you have been the person in a room who does invisible work for a long time, and then someone external to the room sees the work clearly and names it. It does not cancel out the years of not being seen. It does not retroactively fix the dinners where your stutter was narrated to a stranger, or the phone calls where your workshop was a footnote to your sister's sales numbers. But it does something to the internal record, it confirms it. It says the thing you knew was real was real. What I had built over 4 years in recorded rehearsal sessions was not a workaround. It was a methodology. It was the kind of disciplined, patient, evidence-based work that most people never see because it happens in private, at a desk with a small recorder and no audience. And the fact that I had to be alone in a room with it for 4 years before anyone in my family looked at it directly, that is not proof that the work wasn't worth doing. It is proof that value does not require a witness to exist. The recorder is still in my bag. I still use it. I presented to a regional nonprofit coalition in March, 40 people, a conference room in downtown Portland, a 60-slide deck on communications strategy for disability-serving organizations. I recorded the whole thing. I listened back the following morning and found 2 places where the anticipatory pattern had built, and I had navigated it without blocking, and I noted both of them in the document I still keep for exactly that purpose. My mother came to that one. She sat in the 3rd row and she did not say anything afterward about whether I'd had any trouble. She said, "You were the best one up there." It was not a complete reckoning. It was a beginning. I have learned to accept beginnings. If you have ever done the careful, private work of becoming good at something that someone else has always treated as your limitation, share this with someone who needs to hear it. Not because it will fix anything, but because being found by the right story at the right time is its own kind of beginning. Do you think the people who love us are ever fully aware of the ceilings they build, or do they always believe they're just being realistic? This story is a work of fiction. All names, characters, businesses, and events are products of the imagination and used entirely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is coincidental.